everyone. Today I'm going to be continuing the reading of Blaire Wilson's first book by Jennifer Castle. Chapter 13, So Farm-like. I was in the front porch swing the next morning, my stomach feeling better, when a car pulled up. It was fancier than what usually arrived at the farm, shiny and black with dark windows. I couldn't see who was inside. The car stopped and the back door opened. A woman stepped out. She was wearing a pink dress with tiny white dots and gold-toned high heels. Her hair was jet black, so big and poofy that at first it looked like she was wearing a hat. Tied around her neck was a shimmery white silk scarf. The scarf was fastened with a rhinestone brooch in the shape of a smiling frog with long eyelashes and big red lips. The lunch service had started, but most of our noontime guests were people from the area. I usually knew them by name, but I had no idea what to call this lady. Maybe she was lost. Then Gabe climbed out of the car. Wait, Mrs. Vandegrift? Oh my God! I jumped off the swing. Hey, Blaire, Gabe called. Blaire? Where? Mrs. Vandegrift turned to me as I came down the steps. She clasped one hand to her heart and the other to her mouth, gasping dramatically. The Blaire Wilson? She's a real person. She doesn't just live inside my phone, coming up with wonderful wedding ideas. I hid a giggle. For some reason, I'd expected Mrs. Vandegrift's voice to sound like Thea, doing a British accent. But Gabe's mom didn't sound like that at all. I can't believe you're finally here, Mrs. Vandegrift, I said. Call me Mrs. V. You brilliant mini designer. Come here and give me a hug. Mrs. V's super tight squeeze took my breath away. Sorry for the unexpected visit, Gabe said. I couldn't go another day without meeting you in person, said Mrs. V. So I called the car service and lickety-split, I was on my way out of the city. This is great, I said. Cat's in the orchard. I'll go get her, Gabe said quickly. I grinned. And I'll give your mom the Pleasant View Farm grand tour. This way, please, I said to Mrs. V as Gabe headed in the other direction. Our tour starts in the herb and flower garden. I did my best tour guide impression. Thea would have been proud. We don't use any pesticides, so all of our flowers here are edible, I told her, picking an orange marigold petal and eating it. We use them as garnish in the restaurant. I moved down the row so I could pick Mrs. V another flower to taste. But when I turned around, Mrs. V was already chewing on a plant she'd picked herself. It's interesting, Mrs. V said, twisting her face up. Oh no, I said when I saw the plant in her hand. You can't eat that one. Mrs. V dropped the weed and looked alarmed. Well, you can eat it, I stammered. It just doesn't taste very good. Hold on. I picked her some mint. To cleanse your palate. Oh, thank you, dear, Mrs. V said, putting the leaf in her mouth. Minty fresh. Doesn't get any fresher, I agreed. Now, follow me. Mrs. V teetered a bit as her fancy gold heels sunk into the soft soil, but she steadied herself on the dirt path that led to the barn. Oh my, she exclaimed. This is certainly the farm in our farm fancy wedding, isn't it? Yep, but just wait, I called, pointing to the barn. The fancy's up ahead. When we got there, I slid open the barn door and froze. There were stacks of lumber, a wheelbarrow full of stones, and towers of paint cans. Definitely not fancy. But Mrs. V looked up at the cavernous ceiling and towering wooden beams and broke into a huge smile. Oh, I can see the potential! Such a marvelous space! You're going to have so many wonderful events here. What fun! I wanted to hug her. Maybe I could get her to talk to Grandpa. From the barn, I led Mrs. V to the animals and introduced her to the chickens. That's a chicken? She said when I picked up Dandelion. It looks like a feather boa with webbed feet. Would you like to hold her? I asked, thrusting Dandy toward her. No, dear. Thank you. Poultry makes me nervous, but she's lovely. How do you feel about lambs? I asked, waving her toward Penny and Dash's pen. Mrs. V practically squealed. Who can resist a sweet little lamb? They're so darling and gentle and oh! Suddenly, Mrs. V fell over and landed with a thud on the ground. Before I could help Mrs. V up, Dash was climbing on her backside like it was the summit of a mountain. Meh. I see you have a goat too, Mrs. V sputtered. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I said, plucking Dash off Mrs. V. The gate must have been open. Are you all right? Mrs. V stood and brushed herself off as I put Dash and Penny back in their pen. I'm fine, she laughed. More surprised than anything. One of Mrs. V's shoes was lying on the ground. When I picked it up, the heel stayed stuck in the grass. Oh, it's broken, I said. No worries, I can get it fixed in the city, Mrs. V assured me. I don't know what I was thinking with these shoes. I guess I didn't expect your farm to be so farm-like. Do you need to take a rest? I asked. Mrs. V put her shoe back on. Nonsense! I'm not that easy to get rid of. Onward! Mrs. V limped through the strawberry field, the blueberry patch, and the kitchen gardens. I pointed out the greenhouse in the distance and paused by the arch at the entrance to the orchard. I have one more spot to show you, I said, and led her through the orchard to the creek. We stopped at the edge of the wide green lawn in front of the gazebo. Mrs. V took off her broken shoe and rubbed her ankle, balancing on her other foot. This is where Kat and Gabe want to have the ceremony, I said, holding a hand out to steady her. They'll exchange vows in the gazebo, and we'll set up chairs on this lawn with an aisle going down the middle. Just then, Beckett came rushing over. His pants were sopping wet, and he held his hands cupped together like a little box. I found the coolest thing in the creek, he said. You also left Dash and Penny's gate open, I said, and Dash's ball lying around. Gabe's mom tripped, and Dash jumped on her. Beckett took in Mrs. V's bright pink suit and her awkward one-legged stance. You're Gabe's mom? He asked. You look like a flamingo. Don't mind him, I said, clapping my hand over his mouth. He's 7. Mrs. V smiled and put her broken shoe back on. That's okay. Gabe was 7 once. What do you have there, young man? Something pretty? A beautiful rock? Better than a rock, said Beckett after I took my hand away. Look! He opened his hands and held up a frog. A dead frog. Beckett wiggled it around like it was dancing a jig. Isn't it awesome? He squealed. Mrs. V stumbled backwards in surprise. Oh, well, that's... she stammered. This tour was now officially a disaster. Would Mrs. V insist Gabe have the wedding somewhere else? There won't be any dead frogs at the ceremony, I said. I promise. Mrs. V broke out laughing. I've always liked frogs, she said, pointing to her brooch. Perhaps each wedding guest could get one as a party favor. Beckett's eyes widened. A dead frog? That would be awesome! Ew, Beckett. Gross, I pointed to the creek. Get that thing out of here. Beckett left, and I turned to Mrs. V. We both started laughing. I guess we could put the frogs in little jars and tie pretty bows around them, I said. It would be, Mrs. V started. Farm fancy, I finished. Let's head back to the house. We were still giggling when we walked up to the front porch. Kat, Gabe, and my parents were waiting. When Kat saw us arm in arm, she broke into a big grin. Hello, my dear Katerina, said Mrs. V, giving Kat a super tight hug. When Kat introduced my parents, Mrs. V gave them each her signature squeeze too. "It's wonderful to finally meet you," said Mom, eyeing Mrs. V's broken shoe.
"What do you think of Pleasant View Farm?" asked Dad.
"It's charming," said Mrs. V, "and so is Blaire." Mom smiled. "Please come inside for something cool to drink." Suddenly, an idea sparked. "We were supposed to have a wedding meeting tomorrow," I said, turning to Kat and Gabe, "but maybe we could do it now so that Mrs. V could join us?" Mrs. V clapped her hands. "A wedding meeting? That sounds wonderfully official." Mrs. V went to freshen up. I raced upstairs to get my tablet. I changed into my favorite white sundress with little bumblebees on it too, for good luck. This is it. This is the first time Kat and Gabe are seeing all the great ideas together. Will they love them as much as I do? I was about to find out. So that is the end of chapter 13. So I think the meeting with Mrs. V, as disastrous as it sounded, I think went pretty well overall. I think Mrs. V sounds super duper cool. So I'm really excited to have more of the story with her included in it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up. Also subscribe to the channel and hit that little bell for post notifications. Thanks for watching. See you soon.